You're being dramatic. That's what my brother said when I asked him why I wasn't in his wedding party. I stared at him across the table, waiting for him to laugh, to roll his eyes and tell me he was kidding. But he didn't. He just kept scrolling through his phone, barely glancing up, completely unaffected by the weight of his words. You don't need to be in the wedding party to be important, he added, like it was supposed to make me feel better. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms over my chest. Jake, I'm your sister. Your only sister. How do you think this looks? He sighed, finally putting his phone down. It's not personal. Sarah and I just had to make some cuts. It's not a big deal. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Not a big deal? Who did you cut? His silence was answer enough. Not his best friend from college. Not Sarah's cousin who he barely sees. Not even the guy he met at work 2 years ago, who suddenly made the cut as a groomsman. Just me. I felt something inside me shift, something I couldn't quite name yet. A slow unraveling. You know what? I said, pushing my chair back. Forget it. I hope the wedding is everything you want it to be. He sighed like I was exhausting him. God, Liv. This is why. He cut himself off, shaking his head. Why what? I challenged. He waved his hand dismissively. Nothing. Just stop making this about you, okay? It's my wedding. I don't even remember walking out of the cafe. One moment, I was sitting there, staring at the brother I barely recognized. And the next I was outside, the cold air biting at my skin. I shouldn't have been surprised. I should have seen this coming. It wasn't just the wedding. It was the way he stopped calling as often. The way his texts turned into one-word answers. The way Sarah, his fiancée, always had a reason why they couldn't meet up whenever I invited them over. But I let it go. Every time. I told myself he was just busy. That it wasn't personal. Maybe I was the idiot for believing that. I drove home in silence, my hands gripping the wheel a little too tightly. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I had almost convinced myself to let it go. Until my mother called. Don't start drama, Olivia. I pressed my fingers against my temple. Excuse me. Jake told me you were upset. I just think, given everything, you should try to be more understanding. Understanding? My voice came out sharper than I intended. Mom, he didn't just leave me out of the wedding party. He made me the only sibling not included. There was a pause. Then a sigh. Sweetheart, it's his day. He has a right to make his own choices. I closed my eyes, exhaling slowly. You know what? You're right. He does. But so do I. I hung up before she could respond. I sat there in the driver's seat, staring at the dim glow of my porch light. My own mother, the woman who watched me practically raise Jake, had sided with him without a second thought. And the worst part? I wasn't even surprised. I thought about all the nights I stayed up helping Jake with his homework while Mom worked late. The times I made sure he had lunch money, that he got to soccer practice on time, that he had someone in the stands cheering for him when no one else could. I thought about the Christmas when he was 8, when Mom barely had enough money for rent, let alone gifts. I spent every penny I saved from my after-school job buying him the skateboard he wanted. He didn't remember any of that. Or maybe he did, and it just didn't matter anymore. I finally stepped out of the car, unlocking the front door to my apartment. The silence inside was comforting. No expectations. No guilt. Just me. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if that was a bad thing. You're overthinking it, Liv. It's just a wedding. Let it go. My mom's words echoed in my head as I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting my dress for the wedding. I didn't want to go. I didn't want to sit through the ceremony and watch as Jake walked down the aisle with our father, a man who hadn't been in our lives for over a decade. But here I was, a polite guest at my own brother's wedding, the uninvited, unimportant sister. I felt the tightness in my chest when I thought about how it all came to this. It wasn't just about the wedding party, or the lack of involvement in his big day. It was everything. The small moments when I realized he was slowly slipping away, and I was too stubborn to admit it. I arrived at the venue a few minutes before the ceremony started. Jake was already surrounded by his friends, chatting and laughing, looking every bit the perfect groom. He looked happy, relaxed, like nothing was wrong. I walked into the reception hall, scanning the room, trying to make myself invisible, trying to blend in with the sea of people who had been invited to witness this perfect moment. It wasn't until I saw her, Sarah, that I felt the first wave of anger hit me. She was standing at the front of the room with a smile that could have been plastered on a magazine cover. She looked at me, her eyes briefly flicking over me then back to Jake. Not a single smile, not even a hint of warmth. I didn't expect her to embrace me like a sister, but I did expect a little acknowledgement, a little kindness. Instead, there was a coldness in her eyes that made me feel smaller than I already did. I tried to tell myself I was just being sensitive. But then the moment I feared came, the one I had been dreading the entire day. Jake walked up to the front with our father, who had just stepped back into our lives like nothing had ever happened. I had spent years resenting him, wondering why he had left, why he had abandoned us. And now he was taking my place. I didn't know why it hurt so much to see it. Maybe it was because Jake was looking at our father like he was a hero, like everything that had happened in our past was wiped clean in an instant. Or maybe it was because I had never been good enough for him to choose. Jake and our father stood side by side, and when they turned to face the guests, there it was. Jake with his arm around our father's shoulders, the man who had never been there for him, who hadn't even shown up to a single one of his graduations. I had been the one who picked up the pieces every time Jake needed someone. And yet there they were, father and son, taking their moment. I couldn't hold it in anymore. I turned away, stepping into the quiet hallway just outside the reception. The cool air hit my face as I leaned against the wall, closing my eyes and taking deep breaths to calm the storm inside me. I felt like a fool for caring this much. But how could I not? How could I not care when I had given everything, to make sure Jake had the best of me? I sacrificed friends' time, and even my own future to make sure he didn't feel abandoned the way I had. I was the one who had been there when he failed, when he needed advice, when he had no one to turn to. And yet, here he was, giving it all to the man who had walked out on us. It wasn't just about the wedding. It was about every moment that led up to this one. The missed calls, the excuses, the way he stopped coming over, stopped asking me for advice, stopped treating me like his sister. I wasn't his sister anymore. I was just the backup. I could feel my hands trembling as I reached for my phone. I didn't want to make a scene, but I had to get out of there. I was done pretending like nothing had changed. I texted Jake. Congratulations. I hope you both have the life you deserve. I pressed send before I could overthink it. And then I walked out. I didn't go back inside. I didn't stay for the ceremony, or the reception, or the toast. I couldn't watch it. I couldn't watch Jake give all of his love and attention to a man who didn't deserve it. And I certainly couldn't pretend like I wasn't invisible in my own family. As I left the venue and got into my car, the weight of it all hit me, heavier than I expected. I had just stepped out of my own brother's life, as if there had never been a bond to begin with. But I realized as the tears threatened to fall, that it was never me stepping away. It was him. The drive home was a blur. I don't even remember the route I took. My hands were white-knuckled on the steering wheel, but I couldn't bring myself to stop. I couldn't bring myself to go back to the wedding, back to that feeling of being utterly invisible. I pulled into my parking spot and just sat there for a while, staring at the empty street outside. My phone buzzed in my bag. I didn't need to check it to know it was Jake. I already knew he would text me, trying to fix things, trying to smooth it over like everything was fine. But this wasn't fine. It hadn't been for a long time. I could feel the tears building up, but I couldn't let myself cry. Not yet. Not until I was sure that I had nothing left to say to him. I reached for my phone and unlocked it, scrolling through the messages. There it was, just as expected. Liv, where are you? Mom said you left. Are you okay? I closed my eyes. I wanted to scream. And tell him how much it hurt to watch him walk away from me over and over again. But I didn't. I just sat there numb. And then, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called him. I didn't know what I was hoping for. Maybe an apology. Maybe some recognition of all the things I had done for him, for the family. But when he picked up, it wasn't what I expected. Liv, what's going on? Why are you freaking out? Mom said you just left. His voice was sharp and patient. He wasn't asking if I was okay. He was irritated that I had disrupted his perfect day. His voice felt like a slap in the face. Jake, I'm done. I'm done pretending like this isn't happening. There was a silence on the other end. I could hear him shifting, maybe even turning away from the phone. What's that supposed to mean? He asked, his voice tight. It means that I'm not playing this game anymore. I'm not your backup. I'm not just the person you call when no one else is around. He exhaled slowly, as if he was trying to calm himself. You're being dramatic, Liv. You know that, right? I felt my heart drop. Dramatic. Just like always. Dramatic. I repeated, my voice shaking. I've been the one holding this family together, Jake. I've been the one who showed up when Dad didn't. And now, you're telling me that I'm being dramatic for being hurt. His tone softened, but it wasn't comforting. It was condescending. You're blowing this way out of proportion. It's just a wedding. You know I love you, right? I closed my eyes, swallowing the lump in my throat. It wasn't just the wedding. It wasn't about the party or the ceremony. It was about everything he hadn't said. Everything he hadn't done. If you loved me, Jake, you would have made me part of your life. You would have seen me. I could hear him huff on the other end. This isn't about you, Liv. It's my day. You have to understand that. I shook my head, my grip on the phone tightening. No, you don't get to do that. You don't get to make it all about you when I've been the one who always gave. Always sacrificed. He stayed quiet for a long moment. And in that silence I realized something. Something I had refused to admit to myself, until that very second. He wasn't the person I thought he was. He wasn't the kid I raised, the little brother I protected. He wasn't even the man I wanted him to be. He had changed and I hadn't. I hung up. Just like that. I didn't wait for him to say anything else. I just ended the call. I sat in my car for a while, staring at the screen of my phone. The silence felt louder than anything. And as much as it hurt, as much as I wanted to believe that he would come around, I knew that this was the end of whatever bond we had left. I spent the next few hours pacing around my apartment, trying to convince myself I was doing the right thing, trying to tell myself that walking away was the only option left. I thought of everything I had done for him, how I'd taken care of him when no one else would, how I had given him everything I had, only to be met with the emptiness of his indifference. And then it hit me, the final crushing realization. I had spent my entire life trying to fix things, trying to make him feel like he wasn't alone. But in the end it wasn't enough. Jake didn't need me. Not anymore. I walked to my desk, took a deep breath, and started typing a message. Congratulations on your wedding, Jake. I hope it's everything you've dreamed of. But as for me, I'll be moving on. I hit send, and the finality of it hit me like a wave. There was no going back now. The days after I sent that message were a blur of numbness. I didn't cry, I didn't yell. I didn't do anything. I just went through the motions, waking up each day to a life that suddenly felt empty, like I was walking through someone else's story. I thought I would feel some kind of relief, that the weight of holding on to a broken relationship would lift from my chest. But instead, I just felt exhausted, more drained than I'd ever been. I couldn't remember the last time I felt truly seen or heard. I buried myself in work, throwing myself into projects at the office like they were the only thing keeping me from spiraling. But even that didn't feel like enough. There was a hole inside me, a gap that hadn't been there before, and no amount of work or distractions seemed to fill it. I tried calling some old friends, people I hadn't spoken to in months, maybe even years. But I didn't expect them to understand, not really. Most of them had their own lives, their own families. And I wasn't the person they thought of when they needed support. I was just the one who showed up when it was convenient. But I couldn't bring myself to stay angry either. I wasn't angry anymore. I was just tired. One night, after a long shift at work, I came home to a message from my mother. I knew it was coming, the Liv, you've got to fix this message. The why won't you just forgive him message. I almost didn't open it. I didn't need her guilt trips anymore. But I did. Liv, I don't understand why you're doing this. Jake's your brother. He's getting married. And you're making this harder than it has to be. Please just call him. I closed my eyes, pressing my fingers to my temples. I could feel the familiar frustration bubbling inside me. The same frustration that had been simmering since that day at the wedding. My mother still couldn't see it. She couldn't see how much he had pulled away from me, how much I had given and given without ever receiving anything in return. I thought about calling her back, telling her everything, about the way Jake had acted, the way she had always chosen him over me. But what was the point? She wouldn't listen. She never did. Instead, I shut my phone off and sank into the couch, wrapping a blanket around myself. I needed space. I needed to stop trying to fix everything. The next day, I went to work early, the office almost empty. It felt strange, but somehow it also gave me the space I needed to think. As I sat down at my desk, I heard the familiar voice of my colleague, Ben, asking if I was okay. I hadn't told anyone at work about the wedding or my fight with Jake. I kept everything hidden behind a mask of professionalism, but Ben knew something was off. "Hey, you've been quiet lately," he said, leaning against the doorway. "You sure you're good?" I looked at him for a moment, debating whether or not to tell him the truth. Ben wasn't a close friend, but he had a way of listening without pushing. Finally, I let out a sigh. "It's family stuff. I'm fine though." "Really?" Ben raised an eyebrow. "You don't sound fine. Want to talk about it?" I shook my head. "It's just, well, it's my brother Jake. He's changed, and I don't know what to do about it." Ben gave me a sympathetic look. "Family is tough. It's hard to keep people close when they don't seem to care as much as you do." I nodded. "Yeah, I thought I could fix things. But every time I try, it just feels like I'm the one who ends up hurt." Ben was quiet for a moment, then spoke again, softer this time. "Maybe it's time to stop fixing things, Liv. Maybe it's time to let them go." I felt something shift inside me at his words, something I didn't want to admit to myself. I had been holding on to something that wasn't coming back. Maybe it was time to stop trying to make everyone else happy. Maybe it was time to start thinking about myself. After that conversation, I found myself thinking more about what Ben had said. Letting go. I wasn't sure if I was ready for it, but I knew I couldn't keep holding on to the past. I had been so focused on fixing what was broken that I forgot to care for the things that were still worth keeping. Myself, my peace, my future. It wasn't easy. Every time I saw a picture of Jake and Sarah together, or heard my mom's concerned voice on the other end of the phone, I felt a pang in my chest. But I also felt something else, a growing sense of strength. A quiet confidence in knowing that I didn't need their approval to be happy. The truth was, I had never needed them the way I thought I did. Not anymore. I wasn't going to chase after them. Not when they couldn't even see me. I was going to chase after my own life. It's funny how sometimes the hardest decisions bring the clearest sense of freedom. I spent weeks after the wedding, weeks of feeling like I was carrying a weight I couldn't even name, trying to convince myself that things would get better if I just held on a little longer, just tried a little harder. But the truth was, the moment I let go was the moment I started to breathe again. I didn't talk to Jake. I didn't try to call my mother anymore, didn't answer her texts. Slowly, the noise from my family, from the expectations and the guilt, faded into something quieter, more distant. It wasn't easy. It wasn't some sudden rush of clarity or epiphany. It was a slow, painful process, like peeling off layers of something I had held onto for far too long. But in that process, I found space for myself. And in that space, I began to rebuild. At work, I threw myself into new projects. I started taking more initiative, suggesting ideas, and actually believing in them. I had always kept my thoughts to myself, worried they wouldn't be good enough. But slowly, I realized that my voice was just as important as anyone else's. The quiet confidence Ben had unknowingly pushed me toward was beginning to settle in, and it felt good. One evening, after a long day at the office, I ran into Ezra. It had been months since we'd hung out, since I had been able to relax and be myself. The whole Jake thing had consumed so much of my energy, but now that I wasn't letting it, I found myself reaching out to the people who truly mattered. Ezra was sitting at our usual coffee shop, his back to the door. I walked up, and before I could say anything, he turned around and gave me that familiar grin. "I've been waiting for you," he said, as if it had been no time at all since we last saw each other. It felt like home. We talked about everything and nothing, just like we always had. We talked about work, about mutual friends, about the future. And somewhere in that conversation, I realized that maybe I hadn't been as alone as I thought. Ezra had always been there, always had my back. It wasn't the same as family, but it was just as important. I didn't need to fix things with Jake. I didn't need to chase a version of family that didn't exist anymore. What I needed was to keep moving forward. Later that week, I got a message from my mom. "Liv, I've been thinking about what you said. About you needing space. I'm sorry if I pushed you away. I'm still your mom, and I just want you to be happy. Whatever you need, I'll be here." It wasn't an apology for everything. It wasn't a full acknowledgement of the years of hurt I had carried, but it was a start. And maybe that's all I could expect from her. I thought about it for a while, but in the end, I didn't respond right away. I wasn't ready for that conversation yet. I wasn't sure I ever would be, but I was okay with that. I had learned how to take my time. Things at work started to change too. I was promoted. Just a small step, but a step nonetheless. I was beginning to carve out my own path, separate from my family's expectations, separate from the life I had been holding onto out of obligation. I woke up one morning and realized that, for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was living in someone else's story. I was living in mine. It wasn't perfect. I didn't have all the answers, and the wounds from the past still stung from time to time. But I was moving forward. And in that moment, that was enough. I thought about Jake, about how everything had shifted between us, how it felt like the chapter we once shared had closed. And I felt sad. I did. But I also felt a sense of peace, because I knew I had done everything I could to try and fix it. And now it was time to fix myself. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough.